In our Bible geography class, we're going to be looking tonight at Samson, the travels of Samson, the Ark of the Covenant, and hopefully Saul and how he chased David around. I don't know if we'll get that far, but this is where we're going to start. So we're in Judges chapter 13, and as we look at Samson and his life, we see that he was born, according to Judges chapter 13 and verse 2. And if you please look at that, who could read that verse for us? Judges chapter 13 and verse 2. Who has that for us? Young Bay, do you have that?
And there was a certain man of the Jorah of the family of the Danites, whose name was Mammon, and his wife was Baren and Beernah.
Okay, so Manoah and his wife lived in Zorah, which is, right, wherever that went, hit the wrong button, right here, Zorah, in the tribe of Dan. So it tells us he was a Danite in the tribe of Dan. And if you look in your, if you look on page 96 in your book, if you could find Zorah there, that's the beginning of the red line. And the north red line, it kind of juts down south, but at the top there, at the very beginning of that, that's Zorah. So that's where Samson is from. That's letter B in your notes. Samson and the Philistines. Samson was a Danite born at Zorah. So it says then in verse 25 also, it mentions his place there. It says, the Spirit of the Lord began to move on him at times in the camp of Dan between Zorah and Eshtaol. Okay? So Zorah and Eshtaol are beside each other. And so that's where Samson grew up, in this area of Dan, right? Kind of just to the west of the hill country area. And of course, the Philistines are over here. And this is where Samson fought against the Philistines and would, as you see the lines, we're going to see where he would go into the Philistine country. And he obviously had a problem with women, as Samson did, because it always was him looking at women, going down. Even in chapter 14, verse 1, who could read that verse for us in Judges? Kerry, chapter 14, 1.
And Samson went down to Timnath and saw a woman in Timnath of the daughters of the Philistines.
Okay, so there it says where he went. That's the blank in number 1. Do you have these notes?
No, 46.
Page 46. Yes. Yeah, could we come on up here? Does everybody have these? You should have, everyone should have up to page 48. Okay? All right. Okay, thank you, Michael. Yeah. Okay, so Timnath, that's point 1. And we see here where Timnath is, just a little bit to the west of Zorah, Eshtaol, where Samson went. And that was a woman of the Philistines. So our book talks about how the Philistines, and really I didn't read this, but at the top of page 46, the Philistines came and settled in this area. It seems first they had tried to go down into Egypt, to attack into Egypt and get land there, but that was too difficult. So they settled on the southern coast, the western coast of Canaan land along the Mediterranean Sea. And then as they grew, they first were in Gaza, Ashkelon, and the cities right along the coast. But then as time went, they began moving this way. As they began moving this way, as it says in our book, it was inevitable and only a matter of time before they began to clash with Israel that was over here, and really this was their land as well. But so they were, the Philistines were moving this way, and the Israelites were moving this way, and it was just a matter of time before they clashed. So Samson is the main judge of this clash. So then he has this situation. That's where, he puts his, and Samson is not obedient to God. He's not moral. He's also under this Nazirite vow. He's breaking the Nazirite vow. Even in this chapter, he touches a dead lion. He puts his hand into the dead lion to get honey. So that's another part of the Nazirite vow that he broke. And then he does this riddle thing going on with the Philistines, and he's feasting with them and so forth. And they guess his riddle, but he uses that as an occasion to basically slam them. And that's in verse 19 of chapter 14. And Anna, could you please read Judges 14, verse 19?
The Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he went down to Ashkelon and slew 30 men of them, and took their spoil, and gave change of garments unto them which expounded the river. And his anger was kindled, and he went up to his father's house.
Okay, so here's the yellow line to Ashkelon, and you could see this also in your notes. Ashkelon, right on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. So he went from his area of Eshtaol Zorah down into Ashkelon. That's one of his travels there. Then chapter 15, really, to me, this is the high point of Samson's very dark life. Samson was a deeply flawed man, but this was the high point of it, where he really prayed as well to the Lord. And really, he was fighting all by himself on the other hand. And even the men of Judah were turning him over to the Philistines because he was trying to fight them, but they just wanted peace with this enemy that was really moving into their territory. But anyway, this chapter tells about how Samson slew 1,000 men with the jawbone of an ass. And that was in this area of Lehi. And that's Judges, and that's point 3. In Lehi, which is north of Timnath. Is that in your, I don't think that's, Lehi is not referenced in this map, but it's just north of Timnath, I believe. In another map that I have, in this area would be Lehi, but it's all basically in this area.
What verse is that?
And that's Judges 15, verse 9, where it says the Philistines went and pitched in Judah, spread themselves in Lehi. And then Judges 15, verse 19, where then it says he revived when he drank of that water there, and he called the name of that place En-Hakkore, which is in Lehi unto this day. So Lehi is mentioned twice. This area north, it would be north of Timnath. Okay, and then Judges 16, verse 1. Where does Samson go in Judges 16:1? He goes down to Gaza, which is deep in Philistine territory. And again, you could see that in your map on page 96. And here the Philistines surround him, but he takes the doors and the gate of the city. He takes, this is his strength. This is probably, I mean, here he slays 1,000 men with the jawbone of an ass. That's not a very nice weapon to have in battle. You know, it's kind of rustic, kind of a weapon. And here he takes, in Judges 16:3, he arose at midnight and took the doors at the gate of the city and the 2 posts and went away with them, bar and all, and put them upon his shoulders and carried them to the top of a hill that is before Hebron. And you could see this in your map, how far that was. He was nuts. Samson was a strong dude. So here it is. He went from Gaza. They surrounded him all the way to Hebron. So quite a journey. That is number 4. So Samson escapes from Gaza and flees to Hebron. Gaza is still mentioned, right? Isn't Gaza still in the Palestinian country? So isn't this amazing that we're talking biblical history, biblical cities, thousands of years ago, and these cities are still existent. Some are named still with the same name. Some of them the names have changed, obviously, but some of them, like Jerusalem, Gaza, and Hebron, is still called Hebron, I believe. A lot of the cities. Now, this is an interesting passage. I've never preached on this, but I will say Spurgeon has a sermon on like this verse. And I don't have the liberty to preach like that, but he really spiritualizes it, and how Samson took the bars and the gates, and then it says bar and all, and he took it away. And he kind of makes it a metaphor, though, of how Christ took all of our sins and carried them far away. So it is, okay, so I'm not saying it's wrong. That's how Spurgeon preached this text. And Samson as a type, if you will, of Christ. And it is interesting how far he went with it. And yea, our sins, he does take our sins far away. So then in Judges 16, this now leads into where Samson goes to a famous valley, the valley of doom for him. And not the first time does he go for a woman, but I think at least the third time he had the one woman who was a Philistine, and then actually in Judges 16, where he went down to visit a harlot, and now he goes down to what valley in Judges 16:4? The valley of Sorek. So only time this valley is mentioned in the Bible, I believe. So that's number 5. He went to the valley of Sorek, and there he met Delilah. And there she teased him and tempted him and mocked him and cajoled him and pressed upon him. Oh, it says she pressed upon him daily. And his soul was vexed to death. A woman can really turn a man into knots. So she turned him into knots, and he was about to die. And he gave up his secret, though. And the Philistines came upon him. Samson had no sense, I'm telling you. Isn't that something? Because it was like the first time, the Philistines are upon you, And he lied to her, right? He kept lying to her. And you would think he would understand the drift of this situation, that she's really not with him. But he just has no sense, lack of wisdom. And when he went for his strength, what a text this really is. Where it says in Judges 16 and verse 20, the tragic results of backsliding are here right before us in Judges 16:20, when the Philistines came upon him for the third time, and he tried to fight them as before. What happened? He didn't realize it. He did not realize. He wist not that the Lord had departed from him. I don't think Samson's strength was in his hair. Samson's strength was in God and in his obedience to God. And the way I see the life of Samson is he had been tempting God throughout his life, especially with his immorality. And under the Nazirite vow, he wasn't to live a sinful life. He was to live a separated life. He wasn't supposed to touch a dead body. He wasn't supposed to eat of the fruit of the vine, and he wasn't supposed to cut his hair. So I believe you could make an argument that he broke the first two parts of that Nazirite vow. He ate of the fruit of the vine, and he touched the dead body of the lion. And when his hair was cut, that was just the last straw, so to speak. And God just departed from him, and he wist not. But his strength was in the Lord and in his obedience to God, and he was not obedient.
Pastor, as you mentioned that his strength is in the Lord, we do not see that we do not see Bible describe him as a big man. Do you think he was, physically a big person? I don't think so. Maybe that is why his strength, as you said, his strength was in God, and maybe that is why he was able to defeat, and because I do not see anything that says that he
It doesn't
was
describe his
yeah,
physical
yeah,
characteristics,
right,
but
yeah,
his strength is
Yeah.
like superhuman.
right,
It is.
yeah.
It seems like a supernatural strength, and it's because God did raise him up to
Yeah.
defeat the Philistines. And so, yeah, perhaps so. I heard another good sermon one time from Judges 14:6, where it says, when the Spirit of God came upon him, and he rent that lion as he would have rent a kid. And then it says he had nothing in his hand, but his strength was in the Lord. In that sense, he didn't even have a weapon. And the other time he fought with a jawbone of an ass, not really a weapon at all, but he was that kind. And you know, one thing I will have to say, to just give him a little space, you know, is that he fought all alone. It was like he had absolutely no help, no support at all. As I mentioned, the people of Judah even were in Judges 15 and 11. They basically were giving Samson over to the enemy as well, even in that portion. So it was an ungodly time. So anyway, this is the area where Samson lived and did his exploits. And so he went to the valley of Sorek here, and then he is captured and he's taken in Judges 16. And he's taken down to verse 21. Where's he taken? Where he took the bars of the gates of the city. He's taken down to Gaza. And that's where one last time he cries to God, and he pushes down the pillars of that Philistine idol temple to Dagon. And he killed more Philistines in his death than throughout his life, I believe is how it's described there. And then he's buried in the place where he was born, over there in Eshtaol and Zorah. That's the last verse of Samson, Judges 16:31. So that's a little bit about Samson's geography. He basically just lived his life right in this area, though. Okay? Any comments about Samson or questions about his life, his geography, or... I think as far as the spiritual lessons of Samson's life, the verse that I mentioned about how he wist not that the Lord was departed from him, but then where it says that his hair began to grow when he was blinded, you know, he was blinded, right? His eyes were cut out of his head and they were mocking him, but he prayed one last time. He did pray one last time. I think the question, too, people have asked me through the years, did Samson commit suicide when he pushed down the pillars of the temple? Was that a suicide? Was that legitimate way to go? But it says he called on the Lord in Judges 16:28. O Lord God, remember, I pray thee, and strengthen me, I pray thee, only this once, O God, that I may be at once avenged of the Philistines for my 2 eyes. And then he pressed with all his might, and the temple came down, and he did. It says he slew more there than he had it throughout his life. So his life ended in that sense, in a prayer. And he was to fight that God raised him up to be a warrior. He didn't fulfill fully the purpose, I don't believe, that God had for him because of his sin. His sin held him back. Okay, let's move on then to the Ark of the Covenant. And we see how... Oh, by the way, here's another picture, and it gives a little bit of the mountainous terrain of the area. Here's the Ajalon Valley. Remember the Ajalon Valley? That's where Joshua prayed. And what happened in that day? God was raining down hailstones. Matter of fact, there was just tremendous hailstorm down there in Texas. So God rained down hailstorms in the Ajalon Valley, and what happened to the sun? The sun stood still. That was in the Ajalon Valley. So here's the valley of Sorek, and this is where Samson then lived his life. Here's Eshtaol and Zorah. It's just coming out of the hill country of Israel and down into the Shephelah, into the flatter area. Here's Timnah, where he got his first wife, and down in the valley of Sorek, where he where he got Delilah in that area. So, okay, so that's Samson. Let's look now at the Ark of the Covenant, the travels of the Ark of the Covenant. Where was the Ark for 400 and some odd years? The Ark was in Shiloh, which was in what tribe? The tribe of Ephraim. That's right, the tribe of Ephraim. So the Ark of the Covenant, letter C, and number 1, while the Ark was in Shiloh, it was wrongly taken into battle by the Israelites. So look in 1 Samuel, please, chapter 4. We'll go to 1 Samuel now, chapter 4, verse 4. 1 Samuel chapter 4, verse 4, where it says, actually, look at verse 3 at the end, where the people said, let us fetch the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord out of Shiloh unto us. When it cometh among us, it may save us out of the hand of our enemies. So what was wrong with their concept and view of God? Yeah. God, first of all, God is not a box. They almost looked at God as a box, right? And then they thought that Ark of the Covenant itself could save them. So they brought the Ark out of Shiloh. The people went to Shiloh. They got the Ark. And when they went into battle, the Philistines shouted in verse 5. They shouted with a great, they were so excited. They had the Ark with them. But you know what? That was a false shouting. It was a false revival. They had a false view of God. Sometimes people can have an outward display of emotion, but it's just commotion and not real revival. So the Philistines, they didn't give up. They fought. And in verse 11 of 1 Samuel 4, the Ark of God was taken. And then they said, we've got the Ark. They probably thought, we've got their God. They cannot beat us as long as we have their God. But they had a false concept of God too. They were idolaters. They associated God with idols so they put the Ark into their temple of Dagon in what city now of 1 Samuel chapter 5, verse 1? What city here? So the Ark moves from Shiloh. The battle was in Ebenezer. And then the Ark moves now to Ashdod. So that's down here. That's in your, and if you follow along in your book on page 97, that's map 47. That's the battle at Ebenezer. This is the battle at Ebenezer. That's in your notes, point 1. The Ark was taken first to Ashdod, but what happened when they set the Ark of God up in that Dagon temple? What did Dagon do? He kept falling down. In other words, it's almost as if Dagon, this false idol, had to fall down before the Ark of the Lord. And almost like God is telling them, worship the Lord, worship the one true and living God. So it says it fell on his face to the earth before the Ark of the Lord. That's verse 3. So the hand of God was heavy upon the people there. He smote them with emerods. I don't know what emerods are, but I think preparation H might help. Something like that, maybe. So they were so uncomfortable, they said, get the Ark out of here. So they moved it. Where'd they move it to next? In verse 8, they moved it to Gath. They moved it down here to Gath. And the same thing happened. And then verse 10, they moved it to, in verse 10, they moved it to where? Ekron. And the same thing happened again. The hand of God was very heavy there. And so it speaks about the hand of God 3 times. In verse 6, if you see 1 Samuel 5:6, the hand of the Lord was heavy upon them. Verse 7, his hand is sore upon us. Verse 9, the hand of the Lord was against the city. And verse 11, the hand of God was very heavy there. The men that died not were smitten with the emerods. There was a destruction of death even in that city. So they said, we got to get rid of it. And so they did the best they knew how to do. They didn't have the word of God to give them direction. So they put the ark on a new cart. It says in Judges, 1 Samuel 6, chapter 6, verse 7, a new cart. And it went along the way. And what city is mentioned in verse 12? Beth Shemesh. And that's at the bottom now of page 46, the last point. The Philistines take the ark back to Israel by bringing it to Beth Shemesh. And notice now, in that verse 13, it says, and they of Beth Shemesh were reaping their wheat harvest in the valley. Guess what valley that is? The valley of Sorek. That's the same valley where Samson had been, in the valley of Sorek. It doesn't mention Sorek, but that's the area where Beth Shemesh is. And then finally, they took the Ark of the Covenant on top of page 47 to what city? And it was there, 1 Samuel 7, verse 1. Kirjath Jearim. Kirjath Jearim. And they fetched it, and it was there for 20 years, verse 2. So this is the travels of the ark from Shiloh to Ebenezer to Ashdod to Gath to Ekron to Beth Shemesh to Kirjath Jearim, and eventually David will come and move it to Jerusalem, but it will move from there before David moves it. The other priests will move it, but that's where it was for 20 years. Okay, so you got all the blanks there. The blanks are number 1, Shiloh, number 2, Ekron. And are those the only blanks you have in that section? Just those 2 blanks, right? Okay, and here is Kirjath Jearim, over the head shot, and you can see how this is hill country. This is rugged territory where the Ark of the Covenant was in this town for 20 years. Okay, so that's a little bit of that. All right, let's keep moving here. The few moments we have to King Saul. That's number 6. King Saul, the first king of Israel. Of course, Saul was of what tribe? Number 1. Saul was verse 1 of we're in 1 Samuel 9. He was of the tribe of Benjamin. That's letter A. And Samuel, it says, lived in a town. And if you look at 1 Samuel chapter 7, before we look more at Saul, just to give this little point about Samuel, because there is a little map of Samuel's route that he took of teaching throughout his area, a circuit. He was kind of like, the Methodists they called them circuit riding preachers back in the days in the South and in the early parts of our country, where maybe not every church could have a pastor. So Methodists had circuit riding preachers. In a sense, Samuel was a circuit riding judge. And it tells his circuit in 1 Samuel chapter 7 and verse 15 and 16. So, Jeannie, could you please read those verses? 1 Samuel chapter 7, verses 15 and 16.
And Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life, and he went from year to year in circuit to Bethel and Gilgal and Mizpah, and judged Israel in all those places.
Okay, and then verse 17 tells us where his home of those areas was. Where did he live? He lived in Ramah. Okay, so that's number 1. Samuel judged Israel and lived in Ramah. That's the blank, number 1. And here, many people believe that in these areas, as he traveled in circuit, in judging Israel, he also established schools of young men who wanted to learn the word of God. And they were called the schools of the prophets, the sons of the prophets. And after Samuel started them, they seem to have gone into disrepair, but that's what Elijah reinvigorated. And what Elijah was doing the last day of his life, remember when he was taken up into heaven, he was going to some of these cities also. Even of these cities, he went to Bethel, the cities. So here is Ramah. This is where Samuel lived, and the circuit he did, he went to Mizpah, to Bethel, and to Gilgal. Those are the three cities mentioned there. And there's a little map. You see the little map on page 98. And it has that circuit as well. Gilgal, Bethel, Mizpah, and Ramah, his home. Okay? So then we see King Saul. Now, King Saul established, it says, his capital, if you look in 1 Samuel, when Saul comes and the whole story of him being anointed king by Samuel, but 1 Samuel chapter 10, verse 26, where was his home? In Gibeah. Okay, so we come now to Saul and his home in Gibeah, which is here. This is not the best map. I like your map actually in your book better here. So if you look in your book, and if you look in the red box, in the big map, if you look in the red box, at the bottom of the red box, there's Gibeah, has a star beside it. That's Gibeah. Okay? So that's in the area of Benjamin. That's in the tribal area of Benjamin. So that's where he put his capital. And when Samuel was king, his first major victory is actually against the Ammonites. And if you look at your map, and if you go north, and you see the three purple arrows, and then at Jabesh Gilead, and there's a green line, which is the Ammonites, and they're coming and fighting against the men of Jabesh Gilead. That was Saul's first victory. Way up into that north. He went and he helped those people. And he helped unite the kingdom at that point in fighting Jabesh at Jabesh Gilead. He fought the Ammonites there. So that's point 3. Saul's first major victory is against the Ammonites in Jabesh Gilead. That's the story is told in 1 Samuel chapter 11, where Nahash the Ammonite came up and they went to the men of Jabesh Gilead in verse 1 against Jabesh Gilead and so forth. And that's basically the whole chapter. It tells us of that battle. Saul and the Philistines. Now look at chapter 13, verse 2. So after Saul had reigned 1 year and then 2 years, where was Saul in verse 2? Okay, he was in Michmash. Okay, so again, it's in your book. It's in that red box. Michmash, if you see Gibeah and you just go north, so Saul is in Michmash. Verse 2, where's Jonathan? This isn't in your notes, by the way. This is not in your notes, but I think it's actually important. So in verse 2, where's Jonathan? He's in Gibeah. Okay? So now it is in your book. If you look on your book on page 98, he says Saul and his son. I'm on the first column there, Saul and the Philistines, the third line down or so. It says Saul and his son Jonathan gathered Israel's forces at Michmash and Gibeah. So Saul was at Michmash, Jonathan was at Gibeah. And the Philistines respond. Now, so the Philistines see what Jonathan and Saul are doing. And they're trying to gather the Israelites to himself. 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 3. Saul blows the trumpet, saying, let the Hebrews hear. And I'm sorry, I skipped something there. In verse 3, what does Jonathan do when he's in Gibeah? In 1 Samuel 13, verse 3, what does Jonathan do? He goes against, what's a garrison? It's like a what? What's a garrison? It's a fort of some kind. So the Philistines had a fort where? Not in Gibeah, but where? In Geba. In Geba. So let's see if we can. Okay, so here's Michmash. Saul is in Michmash. And our author does say the actual locations of some of these cities is difficult, but But look, just for the sake of, here's Michmash, here's Gibeah, Saul is here, Jonathan is here, here's Geba. This is where the Philistines are. They have a fort here. So this is Philistine country over here. What are the Philistines doing over here? They're infiltrating the land. So Jonathan comes down out of Gibeah and he leads a raid into Geba against the Philistines. And so then Saul tries to use that to gather more support for the Israelites to come. But in the meantime, the Philistines respond and gather themselves a great number in verse 5 together. 30,000, their chariots. Remember, the Philistines are known for their chariots, and because they were on the coastal plain where it was flatter. They did not like to fight up in the hills. So they had their chariots, and guess, where did they go? Where did they go in verse 5? Where did the Philistines now intrude into? Who was in Michmash? Who was in Michmash? Saul. So they move right into the area of Michmash where Saul was. So Saul retreats. It says in the text, it says when that happened, the men of Israel, what did they do in verse 6? What did they do? What did they begin to do? Run and hide. It seems they're very afraid. They're lacking leadership. What's the last word of verse 7? What's their response? Are they courageous? They are trembling, it says. So they're hiding in caves and thickets, and the Philistines, and Saul loses control of what to do, and he offers a sacrifice. He shouldn't have done it. Saul was always offering sacrifices at the wrong time. He shouldn't have been offering sacrifices. He was a king, not a priest. That's where it really got him in trouble with God and with Samuel. Anyway, so the Israelites are trembling. They're running around. They're not equipped for war, because it seems the Philistines really had a stronghold on even within Israel. Because look at the end of chapter 13, where it says they had no what in Israel. End of chapter, verse 19 and 20. To make what? To make weapons. They had no weaponry. So it was the Philistines had a corner on the weaponry, on the ability to file weapons into sharp battle weapons that were efficient in battle. And so that's how chapter 13 ends. And then in chapter 14, we see now again where Saul is tarrying in the uttermost part of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree. And Jonathan, again, leads a raid in verse 5. And if you see there in verse 5, it says, the forefront of the one was situate northward over against Michmash. It's talking about the enemy. Jonathan raids into Michmash, and the other southward over against Gibeah. So in other words, the Philistines were spread around this area now, from Michmash to Gibeah. Now, Michmash, think of this. Michmash is where Saul started. Remember, Saul was in Michmash. Jonathan was in Gibeah. But now the Philistines are in Michmash and Gibeah. And Gibeah was what? It was the capital. It was the capital of Saul's kingdom. So the Philistines were moving in and controlling. And so Jonathan says, we've got to do something. And verse 6 is a great verse of faith, where he says, come, let us go over unto the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for there's no restraint to the Lord to save by many or by few. God could do it through just a few. That's a great verse. There's no restraint. God is not held back by a lack of numbers, by a lack of human strength. And so this is the second time now. It's Jonathan who takes the initiative. And basically, they battle throughout this chapter. This chapter then tells the battle. And if you look in verse 31, 1 Samuel chapter 14, I'm in chapter 14, look at verse 31. Where did they smite them to? They drove them out of where? The Michmash. They drove them out of Michmash and drove them all the way to where? The Ajalon Valley. So here they are in Michmash over here, and they drove them all the way back to where they kind of started, because this is Philistine areas of Gath, Ekron. So they started over here on the coast, you see, and then moved inward to Gath and to Gezer and Ekron. So they drove them back to the Ajalon Valley. And then it says at the end of this chapter, we'll stop right here. It says at the end of the chapter, in verse 52, and who could, Ellie, do you have that verse? 1 Samuel chapter 14 and verse 52.
Yes, now there was fierce war with Philistines all the days of Saul. And when Saul saw any strong man or valiant man, he took him for himself.
Okay, so there was a fierce war because the Philistines had really embedded themselves into Israelite, the nation of Israel, and into Saul's kingdom. And so Saul had fierce war to just try to drive them out. In fact, when Saul is going to die, we'll see that it's right in the midst as well of Israelite territory. There's one last thing, actually. I wanted to read this verse also. It's referenced in our book, and I want to point this out because of the map. You see the map on page 99? You see how it has purple arrows going down into Amalek, down into Edom, down into Moab, down into Ammon. You see that? Those arrows to Ammon, Moab, Edom, Amalek. Okay, 1 Samuel 15, I think that's where God tells Saul to go fight the Amalekites. Remember, that's where he was supposed to kill everything, and he disobeyed God. That was against Amalek. And if you look, please, in just one verse here, 1 Samuel, it's in your book too, on page 98. The verse is 1 Samuel 14, 47 and 48. Can you turn there? I'm sorry. Yeah, I sometimes lose. Goes. I don't know what happens with that, but it goes back to the screenshot. Okay, 1 Samuel 14, verse 47 and 48. And the verses here, I'll read them. It says, "So Saul took the kingdom over Israel, fought against all his enemies on every side." Against who? Against Moab. Now, that's what you call a trans-Jordan neighbor, right? Moab is on the other side of the Jordan River. And then it says, against the children of Ammon. That is what you call what kind of a neighbor? A trans-Jordan neighbor on the other side of the Jordan River. And then he says he fought against who else? Edom. Now you get the point. What kind of neighbor is that? Trans-Jordan neighbor. Okay, so we have to get used to that language there, because it might be a part of it could be a question on a quiz or something like that. The trans-Jordan neighbors of Israel are who? And then it says they fought against Moab, against Ammon, and against who else? And against Edom. And against the Philistines, kings of Zobah. But anyway, so that's why these arrows are here in your book, because of that verse. And he references that verse in the second column under the Saul and the Philistines in that paragraph. You see that? Where it says the ensuing years he fought, won victories over Moab, Edom, and Zobah, the Amalekites, but he could never end his crucial conflict with the Philistines. Okay, so that's a little bit of Saul and his battles, but he was a military king. And again, a very flawed man. Saul, I kind of like, you think he was saved?
I think so.
Do you think so?
Yeah.
I think he was the Judas of the Old Testament myself, but that's my take on it.
It's because when he went to the medium, and then when Saul came up, and Samuel came up, and Samuel did tell him, "Today you will be with me."
Oh, okay.
You know, so,
That's interesting. Yeah.
That's how I look at it.
Yeah. He was very weak spiritually, and he he did not understand sacrifice, because he always took that into his own control. And I think that's at the heart of Old Testament salvation, in that sense of understanding the sacrificial system and its purpose. And Saul just used it for himself. Saul cared about his own prestige and his own power, it seems to me, rather than the glory of God and the name of God. So anyway, we will find out one day. Let me